Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Betsy and Walter Stern Conference Center here at Hudson Institute. I'm Ken Weinstein, CEO of Hudson, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to today's forum for two recent books by Hudson Senior Fellows. And this is, I guess, in this new modern era of all sorts of things, I guess this is the first time we've done a joint book forum here at Hudson for two different books, and so we're happy to do it. The Mind of Empire, China's History and Modern Foreign Relations by Chris Ford, published by the University of Kentucky Press. Chris is to my immediate left. And Rising China and Its Postmodern Fate, Memories of Empire in a New Global Context by Charles Horner, who is seated next to Chris, which is published by the University of Georgia Press. And as we get underway and as the discussion gets underway, I want to remind everyone before you leave that copies of both books are available in the back of the room at a very reasonable price. And available for signing as well. Chris and Charles both have had distinguished academic pedigrees and distinguished careers as public servants before they joined us here at Hudson. Chris as Special Representative for Nuclear Nonproliferation, and prior to that as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State responsible for arms control, nonproliferation, and disarmament verification and compliance policy with the George W. Bush administration. He was Minority Counsel and then General Counsel to the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He also holds the rank of Lieutenant Commander in the U.S. Navy Reserve. Chris is a Rhodes Scholar, a graduate of Harvard College and Yale Law School, and earned his PhD at Oxford. Charles Horner served consecutively in the administrations of President Reagan and the first President Bush with great distinction as Deputy Representative to the UN Conference on the Law of the Sea, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Science and Technology Policy, and as Associate Director of the U.S. Information Agency. Charles is a recipient of the Department of State's Superior Honor Award. Now, Charles has been a China scholar by training for some 4 decades now. He did his graduate work at the Noble University of Chicago and at National Taiwan University and at Tokyo University in the days when one could not themselves study in China itself. And I see Charles's wife Connie was here, and she too tagged along on these adventures. And Charles has many stories to tell of Taiwan and Tokyo in the mid-1960s. Charles later taught at Georgetown University and worked on Capitol Hill, specializing in particular in Asian affairs for the late and sainted Senator Henry Jackson and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, also of blessed memory. And my colleagues and I are honored to have both Chris and Charles, really an embarrassment of intellectual riches, as Hudson Senior Fellows. And I should add that in addition to his China expertise, Chris serves as Director of the Center for Technology and Global Security. Chris and Charles will speak shortly, followed by our two other speakers, Ashley Tellis, Senior Associate with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and then Arthur Waldron, Lauder Professor of International Relations in the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania. And as I think we could not have two more distinguished or more expert individuals to comment on these important new books than the two panelists we have here today. Now, in The Mind of Empire, China's History and Modern Foreign Relations, Chris Ford traces China's self-image and its role in the world order from the age of Confucius to today. And Chris argues that despite its modernity, China is still strongly influenced by a hierarchical view of political order and is only comfortable with foreign relationships that reinforce its self-perception of political and moral supremacy. Now, Charles analyzes the past in the context of contemporary politics and debates as the post-1978 market reforms in China opened up intellectual discourse in that country. Now, Charles's book has been out a bit longer than Chris's and is increasingly acknowledged by scholars as a major interpretive work. I'm sure as the reviews come in for Chris's book, we'll hear likewise. Andrew Erickson, a professor at the Naval War College, writes that Horner's work is nothing short of a tour de force of world intellectual history as projected and contested on the canvas that is China. Jonathan Fenby, who is one of the English-speaking world's foremost authorities on modern China, writes that, and here I quote, Charles Horner has written an important and carefully argued book that suggests new ways of looking at China's modern history. His telling of how that history has evolved, both in the West and in China, is worth the price of the book alone. Now, Charles uses both China's own rich history and the history of China's encounters with non-Chinese worlds as a dual lens through which to view contemporary China's culture, debates, and politics in the discussions about world order and grand strategy. Now, in these works, both Chris and Charles do the best kind of history, not merely antiquarian history, but looking at the past in order really to gain a more firm understanding of the present. Both seek to place recent developments in China in historical context. Of course, the relevant historical and cultural context in China extends much farther back than is appreciated by many commentators today, and so Chris and Charles's work on this is particularly valuable. Of course, and in the best tradition of comprehensive examination and debate here at Hudson Institute, they differ on some points and on analysis, and I, for one, cannot wait to hear their debate. I should add that Hudson, being a nonprofit, that both books are for sale for $20 each back there, and we're taking bets for watching which book is outselling the other. And so this is, these two men are intensely competitive, and we are additionally privileged, as I noted earlier, to hear from two renowned scholars of Asia, and we're so glad that they could both join us. We would be hard-pressed, as I mentioned earlier, to find two more distinguished or thoughtful commentators, and I'd like to thank both Arthur and Ashley for coming here today. Ashley Tellis specializes at the Carnegie in international security, defense, and Asian strategic issues. While on assignment to the U.S. Department of State as senior advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, he was intimately involved in negotiating the civil nuclear agreement with India. He also served on the National Security Council staff as special assistant to the president and senior director for strategic planning in Southwest Asia. Previously, he was commissioned into the Foreign Service and served as senior advisor to the ambassador at the embassy in New Delhi. And likewise, he did his graduate work, like Charles, at the University of Chicago, and is also a longtime collaborator on a number of Hudson projects. Arthur Waldron specializes in the history of China and Eurasia and the history of war. At Penn, where he teaches, he is an associate of the Institute for Strategic Threat Assessment and Response and has been associated with the Solomon and Asch Institute for the Study of Ethno-Political Conflict. And he will explain to us what that means. Now, Professor Waldron has lived in Asia for many years, studying both Chinese and Japanese. He has studied and taught in England, France, Russia, Belgium, and Singapore. He has written and edited extensively in both English and in Chinese. He is additionally a founder and a vice president of the International Assessment and Strategy Center here in Washington, and he did his undergraduate and graduate work at Harvard University. So I want to thank our commentators and our panelists, and thank our audience for being here today, and I'd like to ask you to please welcome our first speaker, Chris Ford.
I hope it's all right if I simply stay seated. It just seems simpler anyway. But thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Hudson. Thank you, Ken, for your kind introductory remarks, and thanks most of all to all of you all for coming. It's not the greatest of days out there, so we appreciate your gumption in getting through all the bad weather. The potential implications of China's rise are, of course, and this is of course why I assume you are all here, quite profound. And this is true not least with respect to what Beijing might choose, in fact, to do with the power that it is in these days acquiring, and with respect to what sort of a world it may try to construct with that. My book, The Mind of Empire, which has just come out, tries to explore a bit of the historical foundations upon which Chinese conceptions of international order are built, starting with the conceptual system that was pioneered by Confucius himself. As I'm sure most of you are very well aware, Confucianism was basically a philosophy of social ethics. But as I understand it, it also nonetheless spoke to issues of governance. Confucianism made important assumptions about the nature of political order, and it had real, if often overlooked, implications for global politics as well. The web of social responsibilities that defined proper behavior radiated outward to all aspects of life, and indeed to the ends of the human, which is to say to the ends of the civilized world, without any inherent limiting principle. In this system, the key to successful governance lay in the assumption that the virtuous prince, in effect, secretes political authority. It's my term, not the sage's. Social harmony was felt to spread outward in concentric circles around the ruler precisely because, and to the degree that, he was virtuous. Virtue was conceived to create and sustain harmonious political order. Now, significantly, the extent to which this occurs is proportionate to the extent of the ruler's virtue and lacks, as I say, an intrinsic limit. The ruler of imperfect virtue will always find his authority potentially imperiled, subject to contestation perhaps, and even doomed to dissolution upon the advent of a more virtuous prince. So a prince of perfect virtue, by the same token, however, will inevitably have the entire world subject itself to him in one form or another. This is sort of the basic conceptual scheme that at least I think Confucianism embodies as it speaks to issues of politics and governance. This philosophy of governance is radically monist. It's naturally hierarchical, and the ruler within this scheme cannot really admit to the existence of separate and co-equal sovereignties without conceding, in some respect, a defect in his own virtue. After all, if he were perfectly, truly virtuous, other would-be sovereigns, and all of them, would at some point inevitably gravitate to his orbit. And of course, if they don't, then therefore he must not be. Just as there can be only one father in the family within the system of Confucian filial piety, so there can be only one sovereign in the world. Now, as I see it, and as the story that I try to tell in the book, this schema has had very important implications over the years. Throughout China's long history of struggling against incursions from abroad, a consistent theme of its diplomacy has been the importance of maintaining formal inequality with China's neighbors. Anything other than at least a symbolically hierarchical relationship favoring China was philosophically offensive and ideologically untenable. As long as no sufficiently muscular or persistent foreign power forced a confrontation on specifically status hierarchic terms, that system maintained its internal coherence and sort of rumbled along over the years without too much conceptual trouble. But things began to change in the late 18th century, quite famously, when the British sought to regularize their trade relations with China and deputized the Earl of Macartney to represent King George III before the imperial throne in Peking. Neither this mission, however, nor two subsequent attempts in the early 19th century had any success, however. Many of you probably know the story. I won't tell it here, but the basic idea is that by insisting upon European-style formalities of diplomatic equality, they simply offended and scandalized their Chinese hosts. The Celestial Empire wanted no relations on those terms and was, in fact, to some extent, horrified even to be asked. These encounters laid the groundwork for what was, in effect, an explicit, remarkably explicit ideological and symbolic sparring match between two competing norms of global order. On the one hand, Western notions of separate co-equal sovereignty rooted in the Westphalian system, and on the other, China's own Sino-centric traditions. Each side demanded of the other things that other could not concede without violating core legitimating principles of its own, and each side sensed full well the implications of every perceived nuance of status and prerogative that were insisted upon by its adversary. This ideological struggle bubbled and boiled for many years, with the diplomatic history of that period being in large part a recurring pattern of European demands for the formal trappings of separate and co-equal sovereignty. On the one hand, Chinese resistance, European threats and military maneuvers in response, and then negotiated half measures, which of course then themselves became the objects of diplomatic contestation for years thereafter. China made such concessions as military duress made unavoidable, but worked tirelessly to attenuate or escape the symbolic implications of concessions that were the most offensive to Sinic universalism. I think it's actually one of the sad ironies of this period that the foreigner's progress in eliciting symbolic concessions from China to modern notions of co-equal sovereignty and diplomatic reciprocity created an appetite for so much more that these very principles were themselves ultimately undermined. China was not permitted to stop at mere formal equality with the European powers, these brash barbarians intruding upon it. She was in fact compelled to accept what was increasingly obviously a position of formal inequality with respect to the Western world. This, in a sort of perverse sense, this was actually less of a challenge to traditional Chinese conceptions of political order than was the idea of equality itself. I mean, after all, it was long understood in Chinese history that a dynasty could lose its sort of all-sustaining virtue, forfeiting the mandate of heaven and therefore inevitably collapsing. The succession of legitimacy to foreign overlords was something that China had in fact experienced before. What would have been truly revolutionary, in my view at least, within the terms of the Chinese system, would have been a consistent insistence upon norms of genuine sovereign co-equality, which had no antecedent in China's millennia of fairly obsessive historical self-regard. But the Western world passed up this opportunity by letting its appetite run away with its principles. As a result, China arguably did not have to come fully to grips with norms of modern international sovereign equality, for it was before long plunged into obvious inferiority vis-a-vis the West, most famously with the numerous unequal treaties into which it was forced by European military power. So the ironic outcome of this 19th century ideological battle may have been, in fact, simply to reinforce age-old Chinese lessons about the universally hierarchic nature of power. Now let's turn to the communist period, if you don't mind me jumping ahead a bit with the fast-forward tape. One might have thought that China's communist revolution would have upended the traditional order of things in such a way that these ancient conceptions would no longer matter. But I think that these Confucian-derived notions actually did seem to persist to some extent during the communist period. Through Maoist eyes, the ideological purification and reconstruction of Chinese society was the necessary starting point for its engagement with the outside world. A revolutionary transformation of the international order would follow naturally from this kind of internal success. As in Confucianism, therefore, establishing perfect virtue at home would have a ripple effect in reordering the world in concentric circles around China, establishing a harmonious social order, a socialist order, everywhere. Such a psychology may also have made virtually inevitable the eventual collapse of China's relationship with the Soviet Union, as China under Mao became increasingly uncomfortable with Soviet leadership of the communist bloc and more keen to assert Mao's primacy as the exemplar of socialist virtue. For his rule to be both legitimate and secure in traditional Chinese terms, the great helmsman could be nothing other than that pinnacle of moral exemplary conduct. And it didn't end there. I think these are things which, to some extent, can be seen in modern reflections as well. An understanding of Confucian-derived notions of global order also, I think, provides an illuminating window into Chinese approaches to the world in the post-Mao era. One probably sees reflections of these themes, for instance, in how China has insisted upon the purity of its own intentions, even when they are patently self-aggrandizing. One can see it perhaps in the Communist Party's reluctance to admit errors and in its extraordinary sensitivity to criticism as well. These are some of the modern instantiations of traditional mandate of heaven thinking and the natural result of Confucianism's virtue-keyed conceptions of political order. To raise questions about such things is to impugn the fundamental legitimacy of party rule. As of old, it would seem, political authority is a derivative function of one's presumed moral authority. So, in fairness, it must be said that an emphasis upon China's supposed virtuousness is, of course, very tactically useful as well. And I think it's here where the demands of Confucian theory and realpolitik statecraft to some extent have come to coincide. A key element of China's strategy since the end of the Cold War has been a campaign to allay any fears that might arise about China's intentions as its power grows. A campaign, therefore, to, in effect, to prevent counter-mobilization, to preserve the environment that China needs for its growth. The point is to bring about a world that is supportive of China's orderly modernization at home and its ascent to great power status abroad. And Beijing has engaged in an ongoing concerted effort to portray China's ascent as being both inevitable and, importantly, non-threatening. And that's where the virtue aspect comes in. Whether this last bit about being non-threatening is actually true, of course, will depend upon what China actually chooses to do with the power that it's acquiring. How will a risen China actually behave? One might try to seek clues to this in how China has come to conceive the modern world. With the sort of economically, politically, ideologically, physically destabilizing arrival of Western power, China needed a framework with which it could, a frame of reference, if you will, with which it could understand its environment. And to this end, China did what it has so many times before always done. It turned to its own history for conceptual models. Now, from the mid-19th century to the present day, the Warring States period, as it's called, of China's ancient pre-unification history provided both a model for admitting the possibility of sovereign relationships between states and a series of classically hallowed prescriptions and approaches to coping with such relations. The problem, however, with this is that while the Warring States period does indeed offer the sort of the paradigmatically Chinese illustration of interstate order, its key lesson, as it's been seen through the prism of Chinese history for a very long time, and one that's been reinforced by millennia of cycling between unification and fragmentation, is that interstate order is both undesirable and temporary. Chinese history, at least as I see it, seems to provide no precedent for the stable and long-term coexistence of co-equal sovereigns. The modern world may be understandable through the prism of the warring states, but it is understandable only as a way station along some presumptive road to some kind of hierarchical order. Now, where does all this go next? I think, for now, it still clearly seems to be in China's interest generally to adhere to, and indeed to insist upon, Westphalian norms of separate and co-equal sovereignty, and especially their corollaries of sovereign rights and non-interference. This helps provide Beijing with the breathing room that it needs in order to grow into a first-rank power without provoking countermoves. Now, the key question, of course, for the future is what will happen as China's power grows, and especially if it assumes the top-tier position that it considers to be its birthright, a position, I might add, which these notions of virtue-derived political authority may encourage it to believe that China must have if its rule at home is in fact to be legitimate. Will China by then have generally internalized Westphalian norms? Or will China, when its growing power gives it, one might say, more options, be more inclined to try to nudge the world system into something more like the kind of monist model with which its ancient traditions and expectations would make it more comfortable? I mean, obviously, all we can do at this point is speculate. It may be, of course, that China actually has or will have internalized Westphalian ideals, and that it will have replaced its vertical conceptions of power with conceptions that operate more on the horizontal dimension. If so, that's fine. Not all observers, I suspect, are likely to be, or China's neighbors, are likely to be quite so sanguine about it. The most alarmist alternative interpretation might be to suggest that these ancient conceptions mean that a risen China will embark upon some kind of aggressive campaign of global imperialism. I don't think that's terribly likely, although, of course, one can do no more than guess. Historically speaking, China's efforts to impose Sinocentric order by force have manifested themselves in regional rather than global activism. That doesn't rule out attempts at global dominion, of course, but and of course the alarmist might respond that China has always considered it important to dominate the known world, and as its horizons have expanded, perhaps also will its ambitions. But while that's conceivable, I think it's very unlikely. To be sure, even a merely, if you will, regional irredentism, especially one keyed to the territorial high watermark of the Qing dynasty, would be very problematic in its own right. But I think perhaps such geographic and civilizational rootedness might attenuate China's global aspirations per se. I think it's also probably worth noting that exertions of Chinese power vis-a-vis non-Chinese peoples on its periphery and farther afield have often in the past been satisfied by relationships much more akin to simply those of homage. Symbolic indicia of moral hierarchy frequently suffice, it would appear, to satisfy Sinic conceptions of virtue-derived global order. So beyond the Qing frontier, at least, actual control may not in fact be considered all that important. Of course, what would be considered important is an open question. I'd be very surprised if China were ever to insist upon formal tributary relationships with anyone, as in the past. But this doesn't mean that some modernized or perhaps more informal analog to tribute diplomacy could not, in fact, be developed. One could imagine a system of order which is, in fact, a genuinely interstate system, in the sense that Westphalian values prevail at the level of formal diplomatic and juridical propriety, and yet in which a powerful China seeks the status of primus inter pares, first among equals, and expects awestruck and submissive foreigners to exercise their sovereign rights, which they would in fact possess, by choosing freely to defer to her in a variety of ways. Indeed, China has something of a historical model for this in its own springs and autumns period. In that era, quite a long time ago now, before unification, emergent proto-states functioned, for all intents and purposes, as independent entities. But the still regnant Zhou dynasty still exerted over them a nominal sovereignty that was supported by status hierarchical rituals and tributary political symbolism. But again, I merely speculate. This is speculation about the kind of world that a sort of surviving Sinic moralism might conceivably feel itself inclined to seek. To know the real answer, we'll have to wait and watch while China lives out its relationship with modernity. And as Charles will no doubt discuss, China has many conceptual options on its plate as it surveys its future, and as it imagines itself and projects that identity into the 21st century, the mid-21st century and beyond. Will a risen China adhere to Westphalian norms, or will it be inclined to pursue an order system with which its traditions would make it more comfortable? the answer, I think, will turn out to be, whatever it is, quite central to 21st century geopolitics. Looking forward to our discussion and to hearing what my colleagues up here have to say. Thanks.
I'm also going to follow Chris's lead in remaining seated, mostly because there was once an international meeting, a very distinguished French diplomat said that when he was an academic, he attained to his dignity by standing behind a desk, but now that he had become a functionary bureaucrat, he attained to his full dignity when seated behind a desk, and therefore he thought that was more appropriate under the circumstances. And so it is here, see that we have reverted, I suppose, to our bureaucratic past. I do want to thank all of you for coming, and it's really it's a good crowd, as Chris said, for this kind of a day. One of the things Arthur Waldron's been interested in is the Christian education in China and the Christian colleges that were established there and so on. And as I thought about this, I was reminded of the concept of the rice Christian, which many of you have heard. That would be the person who would come, listen to the preaching, take the rice and go home and be no more the Christian for it. And I guess we have an analog here in Washington. You might say the lunch strategist, you know. And so for all of you to be here without the inducement of lunch as to the four of us, you know, it's really extremely flattering, and we are, you know, interested in these problems of strategic analysis and conflict resolution. I don't know, made more optimistic having learned of the impending reconciliation of Bristol and Levi. So that's one of the things that it shows you that no conflict, therefore, is intractable, even the one between China and the rest of the world, and so on. I'm just going to say a few words about this book called Rising China, Its Postmodern Fate, and to say that it is not merely about China as such, but it's about the study of China and how people, both Chinese and Westerners, come to their understanding of China. The title of the book is quite consciously borrowed from or mimes another book called Confucian China and Its Modern Fate. It was in fact a trilogy, but we'll call it one book because the three components were thin. And it's published 50 years ago. About the three appeared between 1958 and 1965. And they were work of a man named Joseph Levinson, who was a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. Levinson actually died in 1969 in a kind of freakish boating accident when he was 49, but had already published quite a lot on what was a kind of central theme of people in his generation. Levinson and others, unlike people, say, of my age, had a lot of direct personal exposure to China. He himself had been in the war and had initially developed an interest in Japan, but there were lots and lots of Americans who had been to China, going back and forth, missionaries, educators, businessmen, students who had been there going back well into the 19th century. And they had had a particularly large influence on what went on there, or so they thought. Institutions were established. Lots and lots of Chinese people came to study here in the United States and went back and staffed up the ministries and had lots of relations with Americans. And so a kind of picture of China emerged for people of that generation, no matter their politics, about sort of what the place looked like. And you might say, well, it looked like kind of China, that is to say, informed by Pearl Buck and Chiang Kai-shek and Henry Luce and Madame Chiang Kai-shek and so on. In other words, it was a place we thought we knew, we understood, and had some kind of simpatico with, especially as Americans, but other Westerners as well. Now, on October 1, 1949, something really startling happened, which was the proclamation of the new People's Republic of China in downtown Beijing. And besides anything else that it represented, it changed the look of China, changed the appearance of China. The China we thought we saw was all of a sudden radically changed. And so people were now wearing blue padded suits, little Mao caps. And startlingly, when you think about it, we're used to it now, because after all, Ken almost said red China or communist China. So we're used to this idea, but it's really hard to get used to. And so you look at the parade on October 1, 1949, they carry these gigantic portraits of four white guys. one of whom's a German Jew named Karl Marx. The other is his friend Engels, and Lenin, and Stalin. It's really quite surprising, and it had happened quite suddenly. So people say, well, what has happened here? This is truly, this is truly extraordinary. That's to say, the China we thought we knew seems now to have been replaced by something else, and not on any kind of orderly continuum, mind you, but something quite startling, and so on. And so for scholars like Levinson and others who were suddenly cut off from China, you see the Americans couldn't go to China after 1949. We had the Korean War, we had this era of bad feeling, and so on. Question arose, so how do we make sense of this? What's been going on here? Why didn't we understand this? Why didn't we see this coming? Could it really be the case that in the last century and a half, this is what had been gestating in China, that there was going to be a parade where people would carry portraits of four large portraits of let's call them Europeans, especially the assertion of independence, because after all, in one sense, this was a high point of China's westernization. Not only did they adopt a Western-derived ideology, but they involved with these Western-looking guys and lots of deference to a Westerner, albeit a fellow, well, not really a Russian, a Georgian named Stalin. It was altogether curious. So they set out to try and explain how all of this happened, and people who had that experience of China personally weren't all that unsympathetic to the triumph of the revolution in China. I don't mean that in a political way or in any other way, because China was really a seriously dysfunctional place. Huge amounts of suffering and misery that had gone on for a long period of time. Lots and lots of violence. And so the advent of the regime, even by people who were not at all partisan in any sort of sense, you might say was a certain version of change you could believe in, or at least change you thought might be sort of beneficial. Now, at the level of intellectual history, what had to be explained is precisely why this intellectual tradition, a building for centuries, well established, very, very diverse, highly respected as part of the entry into government and influence, somehow just came to be replaced by these notions that are, in one sense, Chinese, but maybe they're not. So there's a long argument. How Chinese is Chinese communism? Is it more Chinese, less, all of these other kinds of questions. So there's no criticism of Levinson to say, and he like him, that they had decided that, well, this tradition had been displaced by this. In other words, this was the modern fate of Confucianism. This was to be its fate. We were going to have communist China. Maoist China was going to be here. It was probably going to be a good thing on balance, and that was just how it was going to be. Now, to simplify sort of more learned arguments, some people had a certain sense of ruse or regret that this thing had passed into history, but that's sort of how it is. But Mao Zedong died in 1976. There was a brief, very intense power struggle. All of a sudden, a new crowd came into power. There's Deng Xiaoping and the reformist group. And all of a sudden, they began to institute reforms. And in very short order, the literal appearance of the place changed once again. People stopped wearing the blue suit. The automobiles appeared. Pretty girls appeared in China once again. Startling. They looked like the Shanghai girls of the 1930s that you may remember from the movies, Anna May Wong, who was not actually Chinese, or the exoticism, you see, the exoticism, the beauty, the variation of the East, which we had become used to in our worst Orientalist moments for many centuries. Somehow we appeared to say, oh, this looks very familiar to us. We know what this looks like. We had tall buildings. Years go by, people have cell phones, people send email. Now this is really change you can believe in, or at least it's change that you can recognize. These folks are becoming more like us. But this is a problem for those of us who study China, because after all, where did this thing come from? We got caught by surprise the first time, and I don't care what people say now. Even the CIA did not predict after Mao's death that there would ensue 30 years of sort of proto-capitalist development in China, leading to even farsighted people, I dare say, the University of Chicago, let alone at the place these other guys were. And so I got interested in this question of what the Chinese themselves were trying to make of this. How do they understand their own situation? Where did we come from? What is this about? And so on. And one of the things this involved of necessity was a new reading of the past, because there had grown up a sense that the past, all of it, from Confucius times to all of the dynasties, was somehow preparing itself, was sort of teleological, you might say, preparing itself for the advent of the proclamation of the People's Republic of China. This had been the purpose of capital H history, you know, good Marxist notion. It's a good Chinese notion too, if you were kind of a millenarian Buddhist, not if you're I mean, it's important strands of thought in China. If you're a good Christian or even a bad Christian, I mean, there were Christians in the 19th century who led a thing called the Taiping Rebellion, which was designed to establish a kind of quasi-Christian socialist sort of thing in China, claimed 20 million lives before it was suppressed, and so on. And so the Chinese themselves, looking to their own past, and began to look at, well, how should we read our history? How has it prepared us for what we've got now? And I talk about first of all, they talk about three of their recent dynasties. We'll say recent. One was the Yuan dynasty, the other Ming, and then finally Qing. Well, Yuan was, of course, it creates a real problem to begin with. That was the dynasty of the Mongols. And China was part of the Mongol Empire. And Kublai Khan, who was called upon by Marco Polo, was actually one of Genghis Khan's grandsons. So here you have China. It's part of China, quote unquote, China. But it's not really China at all. It's part of somebody else's empire. And is there perforce not very, it is in one sense Chinese, but in another sense, you will pardon the term, cosmopolitan, international, multinational, and so on. And it turns out upon deeper reflection that these fearsome Mongols were actually, you know, what we would consider to be multicultural people, you know. They would hire people, wrote in Persian, Turkish, and so on. So that is in other words, a sense of the world order that can encompass not merely China, but somehow Iraq and somehow Middle Europe and parts of Russia, all under the influence of if not one guy, at least the Khan family. You know, not Herman, nor AQ, but Chinggis himself, the Chinggis Khan, the Prince of Conquerors, as he's known to his friends. Now, after that lasted till about 1280, 1360 or so, appears the Ming Dynasty, which is a purely Chinese thing. It's founded by a Chinese sort of peasant, tough guy, autocrat, much admired by Chairman Mao, takes no sass from intellectuals, and yet, after a while, the place is quite conscious of the fact that it is, there are two things called China and not China, and it's China, and all this other stuff is that. And here I venture into very treacherous territory because Arthur has written a definitive book on the Great Wall of China about what's inside and what's outside, and I don't want to say any more about that, other than the sense that this is a very different sense of China. And the Ming Dynasty comes to grief in the middle of the 17th century. A new dynasty established, regrettably, from the point of view of being a good Chinese person, it's not Chinese either. Founded by Manchus from Manchuria, who come in and take over, as it were, China, and then to China add Tibet and Xinjiang and other places, creating what we think of as China. China itself is now part of someone else's empire, namely the Manchu Empire. It has certainly the most important part, but it's not the only part. And the Manchu emperors, as we now come to understand, don't think of themselves as Chinese at all, but people with a very variegated kind of imperial portfolio, and so on. The Manchu dynasty abdicates in 1912, and of course we will, if not celebrate, at least mark this abdication in 2012. We're hoping with all kinds of conferences, meetings, and things going on here at Hudson Institute. So the CEO Weinstein, who's looking down, needs to look up, finds us the money to that kind of a bash, but we're working on that. But you see, the point is the Manchu dynasty then creates what's now called China. The Republic of China says, well, we have received abdication of the last emperor. How many saw the movie The Last Emperor? Which you all saw. Abdicated something called the Republic of China. It never existed before. No one knew what it was. The Republic of China had no meaning or existence. Well, what is it? And at a meeting said, well, this Republic of China will be the Qing Empire. And that is more or less what people have thought of as China ever since. So the Qing dynasty, which was once thought of as some people who had, sold out the country to the white people, the Manchus and the white people colluding against the Chinese, say, no. They've created, as it were, the one China, the new China, the unified China, and indeed there's lots of, they like the Manchus now. They're restoring buildings and declaring Manchu things declared World Historical Sites and so on. But you see, what this suggests is that you can look at different times and it becomes a very tricky business to figure out what you're talking about when you're talking about China, when you're talking about the empire, when you're talking about its components. In any case, there's another level of complexity, which is that all the homegrown traditions offered these folks a way of thinking about themselves and their situations. And then they had to graft onto that a new way of thinking about it, which is called the modern Western way. And so today, let's call him a thoughtful Chinese person who's living in the modern world, has to rely not only on his intellectual inheritance, which is kind of in the bones, it's something that he is, but there's a whole range of Western-derived thinking about world affairs, but about capital H history, about which way history works and so on. And distressingly and confusedly for many people, all the forms and all the vocabulary and all the fads of contemporary PRC conduct are Western, no matter what's going on inside their mind. And one wonders about this level of kind of cognitive dissonance. I mean, PRC is part of a world system now. It didn't create it. UN and World Trade Organization and so on. Although ROC was present when all this stuff was created, it didn't create it either. It was a kind of invited guest. And Hu Jintao, you see, wears a suit, he wears a tie, goes to the UN in New York, gives a speech pretending to believe in all this stuff about global warming, says we're a modern country because, hey, we make solar panels. And there's good reason to believe that they don't really believe in the salience of global warming, or if they do, they believe it's a plot to restrict their economic growth and reduce them to some sort of, as to other people. But it doesn't matter, because somehow there's a requirement of living in polite society that you must bend to these kinds of things, and then they become self-fulfilling norms. So it's a very complicated form of interaction, and in the book I try and discuss how other things in the Western notions of modernity entered into this. Unfortunately, we Westerners have been, in this modernity stuff, have really been really unreliable. Unreliable as far as China is concerned. You may remember the turn of the last century, we go Victorianism, and that's what it meant to be modern, hip, with it, and up-to-date and powerful. That all collapses in World War I, and that is all Chinese intellectuals are thoroughly disillusioned. They say, well, we must become Bolsheviks. That's the next new thing. So they become Bolsheviks. And then lo and behold, that collapses on them. Collapses, they understand it's collapsing, which is why they go through reforms. And then the whole thing collapses. The Soviet Union collapses on them. So what is this about? How does this happen? What does it mean for us? 1991, we enter, I don't know what the post-1991, the neoliberal post-something consensus. And I was happy with that. And then Bear Stearns collapses in 2008. And they said, wait a minute, you bastards have misled us again. First you held up Prussia and England and so on. Then you started World War I. Then you get this is Bolshevism, and look at the damage it did to our country. Listening to your stuff for 4 decades turns out to be not right. And then we became the good globalization people, and now look what's happening to us. So I think the point is that all of this stuff, it never does quite get resolved in real life and real history, so it seems to me. And I think that's part of the Chinese view. Things changing all the time, and you just have to figure out how to stir your way through it. I'll conclude by saying I'm working on the second volume, to which I've given the really down-to-earth subtitle at the moment called Grandeur and Peril in the Next World Order, trying to understand how China is going to respond to all of these sneaky tricks which capital M modernity has played on them, and ourselves as well. We're all stuck with it now, which is where the postmodern has become, in a certain sense, more and more like and becoming modern, whatever that means, and to the degree to which we come increasingly to resemble each other, at least in the way we work and how we live, and doing this in meetings all the time. They do that now too. These Chinese people sitting like this with thumbs, sending messages. It's that aspect of it is quite remarkable. But I think I like to think of the postmodern fate of us all as this pursuit, this endless pursuit of this. Of what might be called the chimerica of modernity. It's always out there, and we're never going to get it. But out of all of this mess, the void or whatever we will call it, the China and we, I think at the same time, are going to have to figure out what is our worldview, and therefore what is our grand strategy for coping and getting ourselves through this.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Charles, for inviting me here this afternoon to comment on these two books that were presented to you by the authors themselves. I'm not a sinologist, and I know not very much Chinese history, just enough to be dangerous. So I read these books from the perspective of someone who's interested in the international relations of Asia, and particularly in the way states attempt to manage power in order to protect and maintain certain forms of rule within while achieving certain objectives without. And I must tell you that these two volumes are truly fascinating and very complementary. They attempt to answer the two questions that are on the minds of policy practitioners today in the United States and certainly in Asia. And that is, what will China be and what will China do? And these are the two questions that are on everyone's mind, because the rise of China as an economic giant in the last 30 years holds the potential of some kind of a power transition in the international system. And even if that power transition doesn't quite take place, that is, China does not end up displacing the United States, the fact is it is likely to become a major power of great consequence, which will have an impact not only in Asia and globally. And to that degree, China's arrival will represent a systemic transformation. And because that is a possibility, and a realistic possibility, the question of what China will become and what this new China will do is something that obviously captures our attention. Both these books attempt to engage that question, but they don't engage that question at the level of practical politics that most people in this city usually imagine is constituted by the word policy. So you will find it hard, even if you traversed the many hundred pages that the two volumes together come to find discussions about Taiwan or to find discussions about the South China Sea. To which I say, hooray and hallelujah, because there are plenty of tracts that are put out by Washington think tanks, including the one that I work at, which deal with these issues. Rather, this book is an attempt to engage the question at a more philosophical or at a more foundational level, which is to understand what is happening within these societies, what constitutes the ideational and social makeup in these societies, what constitutes the structures of rule, and how do those structures of rule affect the ability of elites to both understand their past and relate to the environment. And it's done at a level of sophistication that, in the place where I was educated, would justify the use of the adjective scholarly. But equally interestingly, it's done with a lot of grace. And both books are written with a certain felicity that is very hard to find in modern academic tracts. So even though the subjects are actually quite weighty, you can read the books almost like a novel. Charles's work is easier to read than Chris's, but Chris's work is not for want of felicity. It's simply because the concepts that he engages are more abstruse. But that someone like me who has an attention span of 5 minutes, I have acquired the Washington disease. And the fact that I survived the book, reading both ends of it from cover to cover, really should tell you that this is a book that you can in fact read and that I would urge you to read. So please treat whatever I've said so far as really a resounding endorsement of the work. It forces you to think anew. It educates you about things you don't know, which is really, in some sense, best accolades that one can offer to both these books. Let me try and say something, though, about the questions that I started out with. As I said, the book engages the two questions of what will China be and what will China do. But it tries to engage these essentially by looking at the deep structure of how these states get constituted. Now, as that great American political philosopher Yogi Berra once said, it's hard to make predictions, particularly about the future. And so, again, don't expect in either book a clear crystal ball-like predictions about what this China is going to turn out to be. What I would suggest is, because we don't have these crystal balls and because we don't know where this China is going, most people who have written about these subjects have anchored their own work in one of three very distinct traditions of trying to understand the problem. And certainly in the tradition of international relations or in the tradition of political theory, there have been three approaches to the problem. One is to try and predict what states or what countries will do by anchoring them to some notions about the human predicament. What are human beings about? What are their deepest aspirations? What are their deepest longings? And to try and discern from that understanding of the human condition something about state behavior. The second approach is to actually look at polities themselves and to look at the nature of the regimes that run these polities. And from an understanding of their history, their culture, their traditions, to try and tease out something that would help illuminate the questions of where is China going and what will China do. And there's a third tradition which has become very popular in modern social science, which is to not look at either the human condition or the nature of the polity, but rather to look at the environment within which the polity is embedded, and to try and explain how states make their choices depending on the environments in which they find themselves in. Both these books, in very different ways, are located in the second of these three traditions. That is, both of them attempt to reflect seriously on China. In Chris's case, a singular focus on what might crudely be called ideology. The ideology that has animated and provided a guide, a Weltanschauung for China's elites. And Chris spends quite a bit of time tracing certain patterns in the ideology of the elites that, in a sense, covers huge expanses of China's history. Charles's book is different and equally interesting, because what he does is tries to understand how the Chinese are struggling to understand three of their own historical epochs from the perspective of their current success, and trying to understand what these three epochs of the past teach them about the possibilities that are inherent in their own condition and what they might or might not be able to pursue. There is a line somewhere in Charles's book where in effect he says, China's future course will be defined, and I quote, by the meeting of memory and modernity. And I think it's a wonderful expression, because it captures the two streams that, in a sense, one has to do justice to if one is to answer the question, what will China be and what will China do? Memory in this construct is essentially China's understanding of itself, its history, its culture, its traditions. And modernity, if I may impose an understanding on the phrase, is the world around China, the environment in which it operates, the things that it has to press against as it moves forward. Now, Chris addresses the same question as well. What will China do? What is its memory? And what is it seeking? And his answers are to be found from what he sees, as he laid out, the pervasive Chinese concern with hierarchy, and that hierarchy as being important for both normative and practical reasons. for practical reasons in China's history, because the presence of effective hierarchies was usually the antidote to the terrible fear of disorder, which animates Chinese policy in different ways. And normative, because if you were successful, then it provided not simply a yardstick by which you could measure efficacy, but it also became a measure of rectitude. And at some point, the two, in fact, even collapsed into one another, where success was seen as an automatic validation of rectitude, and the absence of success was often inferred to imply that the mandate of heaven had disappeared for whatever reason. So when one looks at these perspectives, you get, in effect, from my vantage point and my reading, two different conclusions that are in potential tension. In Charles Horner's reading, what you get is a vision of China that is quite pragmatic, even though internally the forces of pragmatism and the forces of utopianism are constantly butting up and struggling against one another. But through this process, you begin to see a Chinese regime that, in very painful ways, adapts to circumstances that are difficult, that can be disadvantages, but in the process survives and actually leaves an imprint of its own on China and on the world. And so Charles is left with the conclusion that the safest thing one can say about the China of the future, and the China that will interact with Asia and the world, is that you can't really say very much definitive about it. That things change, China adapts, and that it is a work in progress. And that this work in progress comes about because it is constantly confronting a condition where regimes have to adapt to changes that are forced on it from the outside. In Chris's reading, you get more pessimistic conclusions, at least at first sight. And that is, if one can crudely impose an interpretation on his work, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And the more they stay the same, because through all the changes in China's material capacities, the desire to replicate and institutionalize hierarchy, both within and without, remains a continuing mark, a continuing imprimatur of China's domestic and foreign policy. Now, obviously, this creative tension between these two conclusions, I think, lends itself for some creative speculation about how to think about the future. It's quite obvious that a China that attempts to reproduce or force hierarchization, if one may use Anthony Giddens-esque term, that attempts to force hierarchization on Asia and the world is a process that will create regional conflict. Because the processes of forcing that hierarchization, especially if they involve asserting China's own primacy in the system around it, is going to be resisted by others. But the moment one draws that conclusion, one has to face up to, in a sense, the ghost of Charles, who then shows up and asks the question of whether it is even possible to think of a unitary and purposive China, given that China is always buffeted by the forces of change, and that China is always negotiating the outcome of its policies, to which, of course, we are confronted by the other ghost, which is the ghost of Chris, who says that, yes, China is negotiating, but even as it negotiates, don't forget that there are these underlying invariances, and that underlying invariance is the struggle to produce hierarchic order, because it's the only concept that China, in a sense, understands and considers to be of utility. Which to my mind now raises two very important sets of questions, and upon which hinge the issue of what China will become and what China will do. The first is, through all China's negotiations and struggles within, will China still manage to maintain what is in effect a unitary polity? Or will China be constantly struggling to maintain deeper or poorer facsimiles of what used to be the warring states condition? It is the unitary quality, and if China can maintain that unitary polity, then the prospect for having purposive policy, in whatever form that purposiveness takes, begins to become viable. If China is unable to maintain that unitary policy, then I think it becomes far more difficult to understand whether China would be able to be in control of the processes that it seeks to shape. The second set of questions which will arise is, if China succeeds in this process and maintains its unity, and this is a point that Charles makes on his book, in his book, with actually quite impressive and persuasiveness, is that China has now become, whether it wants it or not, a multinational empire, where there is a Han core somewhere in the eastern half, but it's not simply a Han state. It's a state that has to manage not simply diverse nationalities, but because of the processes of modernization that have kicked in over the last 30 years, has now got to manage very fractious elites with different preferences and a set of diverse relationships with the outside world. And this has to be negotiated within the state, even as it proceeds to leave its imprint on the outside. So the second question becomes, if China is successful in this effort, to what degree will the ideological preferences for hierarchy that Chris discerns as being sustained throughout Chinese history, to what degree will this obsession with hierarchization, in a sense, define China's policy? Will it seek to reproduce it in the international system only to the degree that the environment is permissive? Or will it, in an aesthetic sense, seek recourse to the male principle of trying to force this imprint of hierarchization, even if the international environment around it is not particularly conducive to institutionalizing the Chinese version of hierarchization? I come from an old tradition of political theory, which is called political realism. And at the end of the day, I think these two issues have to be kept in creative tension if we have to map the possibilities in terms of China's trajectory. And to my mind, it comes down ultimately to three variables that do not exist so much in the realm of ideas, but in the realm of matter. And the three variables that it comes down to, as far as I can see, is first, the nature of the regime in China. What regime will survive the current dispensation? Will it be a fundamentally utopian regime, or will it be a fundamentally pragmatic regime? As both Charles and Chris point out in their books, China has had enormous experience with both. And both elements have constantly struggled in China's history. And depending on which kind of regime comes out on top, I think you are going to have at least a partial answer to the question of whether China will simply seek to impose hierarchization or simply push it to the degree possible. The second variable that I think will make a real difference is really the structure of the international system in Asia, or to put it in terms of conventional politics, the balance of power. The nature of the Asian political system in terms of the distribution of capabilities will define for China the opportunities and the level of resistance to its own plans. And so in order to answer those questions of what China will do, and certainly to answer the question of what China can do and get away with successfully, I think at some point one would have to make reference not simply to the nature of its internal regime, which is of course a precondition, but fundamentally tell a story about what kind of an environment is a future China going to be located in. And this means, of course, telling a story not simply about China, but telling a story about China's neighbors, especially large neighbors, Japan, Russia, India. And third, I think you cannot talk about the nature of the distribution of power in Asia or the balance of power without fundamentally, irreducibly, making reference to the actions, the status, the preferences, and the choices of the most important power that matters to the Asian balance, which is the United States. And so to, in a sense, complete that story, then you need to have some sort of a narrative about America's capacities and America's choices as well. So if you take the most positive reading of the discussion that comes together in the two books, is that there is a process underway in China whose outcomes are not foreordained. And it's a constant struggle within China to define itself. And the struggle is complicated by the fact that there is no unitary regime, but it's a polity that is negotiating its own preferred choices as it looks ahead. But as it negotiates this, there is a patina of invariant preferences. And those invariant preferences have to do with the normative yearning for a hierarchical order, with China, of course, at the top of the hierarchy, because that's the measure of both effectiveness and rectitude. But whether that goal or that vision will ultimately be realized ultimately depends on these three material factors, which I wanted to point out as being the conditions that would allow us to judge the success or the failure with which the Chinese enterprise, as we look to the future, will manifest itself. So just let me end by saying that, I want to commend once again these two books to your reading. And even though they don't deal with the concerns of practical men, they really have enormous consequences for the practical outcomes that most of you spend your days and some of us even our nights thinking about. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Thank you very much to the Hudson Institute and my colleagues for inviting me, and thanks for all of you, to all of you for coming today. It's a little bit hard to know how to come at these two books and the not inconsiderable amount of exposition and commentary that we've already heard. So I thought I would start out by talking about really how little we know. Both of these books, one way or another, are aimed at the future, and just it's very important to understand how ignorant we are of that. Let's suppose that we could bring back, say from the 1930s, one of the great Chinese intellectuals, convinced Marxist communist writers, somebody like Mao Dun, whose books like Midnight and stories like Spring Silkworms and so forth, those of you who have studied Chinese will certainly know. And I should add, whose granddaughter is a valued member of the Penn Chinese language faculty, although I doubt that very many of her students quite know this fact. What would Mao Dun say about a discussion like this? I think he'd start out by saying, well, look, you people have forgotten the most important insight of Marxism as applied to China, which is that the pathologies that Charles mentioned, how in the post-war period in particular, it seemed that everything was wrong with China and nothing was right. You had, at the end of World War II, you had 70 million families who were homeless as a result of the war, which is greater than the entire population of France. People went to China, and they had the kind of reaction that for a while it was very fashionable to have when you went to India. I mean, you go to Calcutta, and then you'd write a book about sort of the horror of the heart of darkness and so forth. And Mao Zedong would have said, well, what's the cause of all these pathologies? They're all caused by imperialism. They're all caused by the fact that we have, instead of keeping foreigners and foreign trade and the whole system of world trade, which is dominated by foreigners, instead of keeping it out of China, we've let it spread its sort of tentacles into China, and it has been sucking the wealth out of China ever since. And in particular, there is no way that Chinese rural industry, what people did in the off-season from agriculture, make Chinese-style paper, make Chinese-style shoes, make Chinese-style matches, and so forth. There's no way that they can compete with the mass producers in the West. So the minute you let the Swedish match companies come in, then all of the Chinese families who've been making these primitive matches go out of business, and they're already up to their necks in water, and now the water's going to rise over their heads. So if you want to cure China's pathologies, the first thing you do is isolate her completely from international trade. That's how you cure the disease. And once she's been cut off from international trade, then she'll gradually begin to recover on the basis of reconstituting her own indigenous economy. And this is very much what the communists did when they took over China, with the exception, of course, that they maintained close relations with the Soviet Union, although the volume of trade was not huge. There was, in fact, a time in the 1960s when China had no merchant ships at all. No merchant ships at all. I think Mao Zedong would say, look, at a minimum, if you're going to get rid of this understanding of what went wrong with China, you've got to come up with a new understanding. But no one, since the death of Mao, has come up with what might be called an alternative theory. They use this word opening. And it's only if you opening and reform, it's only if you understand that the idea of keeping China closed was long seen as the remedy to everything that was wrong, that you understand how potent this idea of opening is. But beyond that, it's pragmatism. It's sort of let's do what works. Well, Deng said, you know, if you have a black cat, and I don't care if the cat is a black cat or a white cat, if it catches mice, it's a good cat. Well, that proves really there's no such thing as pure pragmatism, because you might start studying cats and say, well, which sorts of cats catch mice the best? And next thing you know, you'd have a whole theory, a whole mass of knowledge that would say, well, the way to know whether a cat is going to be good at this or at that, you know, is to know about its genetics and know this and that. And next thing you know, you're in theory. And this brings us to the remark of John Maynard Keynes, which is much too overquoted, but basically to the effect that practical men are the slaves of defunct political economists. So there's always theory. Whether you say you're being pragmatic and you're just doing what works or not, there's always some kind of a theory. Nevertheless, there's no explicit theory in China at all. If you read official party documents and so forth, it's very unsatisfactory compared to the kind of intellectual edge that used to exist and the kind of assurance that used to exist with convinced Marxists. Now that said, you can say that this is an experiment. In other words, there's an experiment going on the largest country in the world. And no one actually has any idea of how the experiment has been designed, let alone how it's going to end up. And here let me change metaphors. I always say China is like a bus. It's the largest bus that humanity has ever built. It has got more people on it than any bus in human history, and it's going faster than any bus that has ever been built in human history, carrying this load of thousands and thousands of people. Well, you might be riding on this bus and you'd say, well, there's one thing that I don't know about this bus. I better go up and ask the driver. And let's have a destination check. So you go to the driver and you say, where's the bus going? He says, well, I don't exactly know, but as we get nearer, I'll be able to give you a better description. And when we finally get there, I'll be able to tell you precisely. In other words, what's happening in China is a transition. There's no question there's a transition. China today is, in many ways, unrecognizable compared to what she was 30 years ago. But it is an unplanned transition. There's no blueprint. There are lots of different blueprints and overlapping blueprints and sometimes conflicting blueprints. So to change the metaphor yet again, it's often said that China has taken off. I always think of her as being like one of these giant Airbuses. I haven't seen one yet, but apparently they're really quite something to behold. But hasn't landed. And my son, for reasons that I won't go into, he ended up going to an English school, even though he's an American. And when he was at the school, he became the head of the RAF detachment, the Royal Air Force detachment at his school. He had had a brain tumor when he was a child. So the one thing I didn't want him to do was to be flying airplanes. So needless to say, he flew airplanes. And he said, but Daddy, don't worry, I don't do the takeoffs or the landings. They've got an RAF pilot there to do those. But he did do turns and, with high G-force and all this kind of thing. So we are, in the case of China, we are speeding into the unknown. There's no one here in this room who can tell you how things are going to end up, and there's no one in China who can tell you how things are going to end up. Now, of course, that's always been true of history. But this, you might say, is an intentionally unexamined question. And one of the issues that did not come up particularly in the discussion so far, although Ashley mentioned it a bit, is the whole question of how we talk about the impact of China's rise, or China's putative rise, on the rest of the world. You have to ask, how is it going to affect China itself? In other words, what are going to be the internal repercussions of this rise on Chinese society? Well, having said that, let me just say a little bit about the two books, because I do want to have more than 5 minutes left for your questions. Chris's book, let me start by saying that I'm going to praise it. But it's the kind of book that that irritates sinologists. The great Marius Jansen, who was born in 1922 and died in the year 2000, used to say to me when I was his colleague, as he encouraged me to let go of the things that I knew well and study other things that might cause me to see things more broadly, he said, Arthur, one must always have the courage of superficiality. And he meant that sincerely. And Chris has astonishing courage, because here he has written 380 pages, no less, about China without knowing Chinese, without having the most basic union card that you have to have to present at the door before you're allowed into the sort of Valhalla of China specialists. Now, if I wanted to, I could write a very, very snippy review of this book, in which I would go through picking out mistakes in romanization and little misunderstandings here and there. I could really do a number on it. And for that matter, I could really do a number on my own books, because I know where the bodies are buried. So far, no one has done that job yet. And I have no intention of doing it, because I think what's impressive about this book is that although Chris is not an expert on China, he is an expert on the development of thought about international relations and the world community and the law and the philosophy associated with that in the West. And what this means is that he has a set of questions to ask about China that are not generated out of China. They're generated from somewhere else. And it reminds me of an experience I once had of talking to a man who was an economist and knew nothing about China. He started asking me all of these questions about economics, and they were excellent questions. And I couldn't answer them, but I certainly thought that I should. The important thing to ask about Chris's book is, having posed these questions about China, and then having done really a remarkable job of picking through the literature, has he got an answer that is persuasive, or has he got one that is sort of, a certain number of degrees out? And what I would say is that his understanding of the need for hierarchical order and the fact that China is not accustomed, or traditional Chinese thought is not accustomed to considering the existence of truly equal polities. I mean, this is right. I mean, he's basically come up with something that's like the right answer. And it's very impressive for that reason. And it's precisely because it is so focused and it's so intellectually tight that it is, I mean, that's really where its contribution is, that it shines the light on a set of questions. Now, I would point out that there are two issues one can raise with it. One is, why is it that China is hierarchical in this way? And why is it, as the other point that he makes, which is that there seems to be a sort of an inherent tendency to centralize, why do these facts exist? And to what extent are these reflections of social imperatives within China? And therefore, might they not change if Chinese society changed? In other words, if Chinese society became more pluralistic itself in the acceptance of more sorts of roles for its citizens and less insistence that the central government dictate everything that its citizens do, might it not find it easier to deal with foreign countries in much the same way? The other thing I should say is that there is a kind of a counter literature to the arguments that Chris makes. The most important book of which is a brilliant but almost unreadable volume by Professor James Polachek called The Inner Opium War, which is an account of the factional origins of the Opium War. Very, very important contribution. It's one of these things it's worth getting mad at it and throwing it across the room and then going pick it up again and so forth. I mean, it's definitely worth that. Also, the works of Joseph Fletcher and Morris Rasabi on relations with Inner Asia, and the late Father Henry Sirois on relations with Mongolia. All of these raise questions, although Chris has anticipated the answers to some of them in his point that sometimes only symbolism is required, but sometimes the refusal of symbolism leads to decisions on China's part which are genuinely harmful to her interests. And then you have to ask, why is it that symbolism could be that important? And that tends to feed you back into the issues of domestic polity. Charles, what can you say about Charles Horner? What I was reminded of in his remarks, as I'm always reminded whenever I have a conversation with him and then try to get a grip on it and find it kind of slipping out of my hand and floating across the room, is that if I'm not mistaken, Charles, at Penn you were not only the editor of the paper, but you were also the editor of the humor magazine. Is that not correct?
For a while, yes.
For a while, but it was long enough. All right? It was long enough. And there is a wonderful, how shall I say, there's this way in which he comes almost to a point and then he withdraws. I mean, there are more question marks in this book, and quite rightly so, than you'll usually find. Certainly, if you compare his book to Levinson's book, and he's been very kind to Levinson, Levinson's book is rather dogmatic. It's extremely self-assured. It basically says, we Westerners are really lucky, because when we look back at our ancestors, we can say, look, our past means something to us, because all of these people, all of these great people who are our ancestors, like sort of Mozart and Newton and the Greek mathematicians and all the rest, from whom we're of course all directly descended, from whom Western civilization descends, they were creating modernity. Whereas what were these Chinese doing? They're just wasting their time on a lot of completely empty speculations, which today, as Levinson said, are of no relevance whatsoever. They are like exhibits in a museum separated from you by a glass wall. So it's just kind of tough luck if you happen to be Chinese. I can look back with pride on my enlightened ancestors and their religious wars and all of these good things. Whereas if you're Chinese, you just look back and say, big, long dead end. Thousands of years of dead end. The only thing we can do is westernize completely. Well, Charles has borrowed the title of Levinson's book, but he hasn't really borrowed the substance of it because far from being dogmatic, Charles is just constantly raising questions. And he's arranged things. You may have noticed he's cunningly arranged it so that the sort of railroad train of history is so long that you have the kind of the engine at the front, which is where we are, and we're going into the future. And then miles away at the other end of the thing is there's this sort of caboose of tradition. And as the two move, of course they move together, and they're always entering new terrain, and this new terrain is always redefining them. So there's never a time at which the definition of either of them is constant. So they're always interacting with each other, and therefore there will always be more things for Charles to write and for us to think about. Now, once again, there is a lamentable omission in the bibliography. I say this really humorously. I hope you understand that I have the greatest admiration for both of these books. The best critique of Levinson by far is a study of the Chinese philosopher Feng Youlan by a French Jesuit, Father Michel Masson, M-A-S-S-O-N, who was in graduate school with me. Very, very smart guy. He's a bit older than me. And I was digging through some chaos in this sort of entropic place called my library, and I found study notes that we had compiled when we were getting ready for our general examinations at Harvard. And I looked at mine, and I was just embarrassed. This is the most childish, stupid, sort of essentializing, puerile, just thoroughly embarrassing questions. And I just wanted to, of course, I kept them for their historical value, but I was so embarrassed by them. And then I found Masson's notes on the same thing. And I read them, and I thought, I think now, 30 years after the event, I am starting to understand what Michel was talking about. Truly profound thinker. If you want to see him, he's over at the Jesuit Center in Paris. His book about Feng Youlan is published by the well-known Ricci Institute Press. And you can probably find it on ABE Books or somewhere like that, but it's not even a minor publisher. But it is by far the most thorough examination of what might be called the kind of metaphysical presuppositions of Levinson. And what he comes down to really is saying that Levinson saw traditionalists in China as being frightened because they knew that Mao was right. And because they knew that Mao was right, therefore they had to construct a kind of phony tradition that would reassure them. He says that's all wrong. The traditionalists knew that Confucius was right, and therefore Mao must be wrong. And there was a kind of confidence about Chinese tradition that many people, particularly in the West, missed at the time. And let me just conclude. There is probably the leading Chinese intellectual in the world is a man named Yu Yingshi, and he is the only person that we know of who has taught at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. He's been a professor at all three of those universities, and he's taught at them in that order. And he was my teacher when I was at Harvard, and by the time I turned up as a junior professor at Princeton, he was my colleague. And we recently published a Festschrift for him. And I wrote a series of reflections about a souvenir, and this is where I'm going to end. I went with my wife about 10 years ago to the birthplace of Confucius. And many of you know that during the Cultural Revolution, there were little red books called the sayings or the analects of Mao, and people would kind of wave them. And we went into the gift shop, and there were these great heaps of red books. I went over, looked at them, and they said on them, analects of Confucius. Otherwise, they looked exactly like the Maoist text. And I brought one of these back. I was very pleased with these things. And I brought one of these back to Professor Yu, and he said, yes, just as I expected. And he was right. Chinese tradition is out there, and it's going to continue. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Arthur. Thank you, Ashley, for those very insightful remarks. I also want to thank our authors. I think this is actually a very good sort of taking off point for the discussion we'll have, which will be a bit truncated time-wise. Let me simply open it up by sort of looking at Chris's book for a second. And you clearly have a much greater emphasis on Confucian continuity than Charles's book does. Charles, I think it's fair to say, he sort of argues that the absence of continuity requires kind of a process of myth-making, rediscovery, adaptation, reimagining, and you sort of see a more continuous path in Chinese history. I was wondering, sort of beginning with that, and if you wouldn't mind sort of commenting both briefly on what Ashley and Arthur said, and if you can, and briefly, what's your biggest difference with Charles's book? And let me ask Charles to do the same, and then we'll turn to the audience.
Well, there certainly has been in the literature, and I referred to it at one point in the book, a sort of a longstanding tradition in outsiders looking at China and what Samuel Kim calls the continuity versus discontinuity debate. I suppose I fall more on the continuity side of it, but I want to stress that by talking about continuity, these kinds of things are, at least as I understand it and try to explain things in the book, are not things that develop in the form of a sort of an express or clearly articulated ideology, or even one that is necessarily understood in sort of an articulatable form by those whom it has in its thrall, if you will. It probably operates, and my guess is that it, to the extent that this operates so consistently over time, it has an impact more at the level of sort of instinct and psychology than it does in terms of express choices and that kind of thing. And by virtue of that indistinctness, it probably is very profoundly, it is both there, and it is always malleable and negotiable in a sense. And I think that's where it plays into Charles's themes of the details matter. They matter enormously. I mean, there's a continuity versus discontinuity debate in the academic world just for purposes of understanding where China is coming from, but that has enormous policy implications because, of course, what is the underlying framework that drives choices or can influence choices matters vastly when you're talking about a country of the size and potential of the People's Republic of China. And so this is not just understanding; it's understanding with or for a purpose. And so these things matter, but how they play out is going to be a very complex process of iterated negotiating between all kinds of different memes, if you will, that are each jostling for conceptual space in some kind of Darwinian game inside the minds of everyone who has to deal with these issues at all. Very hard to predict where it comes out. All I'm trying to do in my book is identify one of the factors that plays into this, and by no means I think it would be a great oversimplification and quite wrong to suggest there's anything sort of dialectically inevitable about the outcome.
Great. Charles, we'll ask you to do the impossible, which is to speak briefly.
Well, I want about Ashley's difficulties in searching for some sort of utility out of all of this discussion. I remember Ken mentioned I worked once for Senator Moynihan, and we were talking about the SALT talks and problems the administration was having, and I said, well, getting support for it. I said, it's very hard to explain the theory of mutually assured destruction at a rally. So, I can't help it if we can't send in the usual one-pager with 3 options to you guys in the government, and so on. See, tradition, what is tradition? Tradition means it's old. That's what it means. If you look at a place like China, which is, after all, we talk about it as a country, but it is, of course, a whole civilization. It is, in some sense, to talk of China is to say, well, all of the stuff, all of the texts, all of the art, all of the writing in China, a country, and yet it's a whole civilization. It's like bringing to bear all the stuff in Western civilization. And I think the more you learn about it, the more you realize that there's just lots and lots to it and lots of argument. So, in fact, the Chinese themselves debated for centuries the meaning of what the sages had in mind. And there are all sorts of theories about the state, about people for the big state and the small state. There are theories of money, monetary theory, monetarists of all kinds spring up in the Ming Dynasty, and they're trying to understand Why is there inflation? Why is there silver coming and going? All of these things. Some period of time, there's a whole bunch of people who begin to argue for small state that's recognizable, sort of conservatives as against people who are more, statist and arguing about the fundamental nature of people, whether it's good for the poor to be independent or dependent or inevitable, and this sort of stuff. I mean, after all, Confucius himself did not believe in big armies and did not believe in large states and that sort of thing. And so this whole question of what we mean by the invocation of the term Asian values is interesting in that regard. And I mean, I think Professor Yi is one of the people who's been a good sort of a good teacher on these things. So one of the great values of the enormous amount of stuff that there is to read, that a Chinese intellectually interested person could read about his own tradition, about political debates, about philosophical debates, about how to live in the world, about how the society ought to be organized, and so on. It provides enormous opportunities for a whole range of choices and arguments, bringing all kinds of things in the tradition to bear. I mean, one of the things I try and write about is you can review the history of the dynasties and marshal that history for a kind of social and economic and even political policy that's markedly different from the one, so Arthur says, that existed 30 years ago. So I will just say that it is, I find it very easy, actually, to predict the future. It's the past that is hard to predict, because the goddamn past is the thing that's always changing. And all the stuff I learned about America in school, for example, turns out to be wrong. You know what I mean? So it's just this kind of thing I didn't know. I mean, I didn't know that Theodore Roosevelt was a terrible person. We used to learn to pray. Now he's a racist son of a bitch, warmonger, and so I said I didn't know that. Well, it's the same kind of thing. I give these books about a terrible person. Used to love Theodore Roosevelt. I don't know. So,
and on that note, I had in my notes here, I was about to say we've had a very rich and elevated discussion so far, and I hope to keep it so during the question and answer period. Maybe I should head in my notes. We'll open up for questions. Let's try to keep the questions brief, and please say who you're addressing it to and identify yourself, please.
Hi, Jack Goldstone from George Mason University. To be very quick, what about virtue? Hierarchy is one notion in China. Another is moral leadership, virtue. How do you think China will try and exercise that aspect of its past in its international relations?
Well, just to say that Confucius taught that the way you govern the state is have the ruler edifying it. No harsh punishments. So that means the state is in bad order. Problem is that if you look at the communist, you see, one thing we don't talk enough about is this outfit called the Communist Party of China, which, for better or worse, created the People's Republic of China in all of its many iterations and continues to run it. And whatever you want to say about these, let's put it this way, the kind of skill set that is required to get to be one of the 9 guys who runs the Communist Party of China does not, how shall I say, it's got a certain, this is sort of the parabellum culture in spades, And so these guys don't believe that, well, you know what they believe, you see. I mean, they're Leninists in that respect. So, on the other hand, there are people who genuinely do believe and still believe that it is the traditional Confucian view of the official, that he is to be a virtuous man and to be a cultivated man, and that is how the state becomes well governed rather than through, and the fundamental flaw of the state now is it's governed by commands and penalties and violence and all of these un-Confucian things. I think it's an ongoing kind of discussion, frankly.
All right, I think if I could add, I think there's a sort of an open question, unanswered, unresolved tension, if you will. I mean, in the old days, if you will, virtue was very easy to talk of, at least through the prism of ideological purity. One was virtuous to the extent that one sort of was a paragon of a fairly well-defined and articulable body of beliefs and practices, and that could have been the classical canon. It could have been the works of the great helmsman or whatever. But there was a framework through which one could actually approach issues of what was or was not virtuous. It's a very interesting and challenging question. What does virtue mean in a post-ideological age, and how do you speak of virtuousness in that context? I don't think anybody really knows the damned answer to it, frankly. The CCP these days likes to take the kind of validation by success approach that Ashley mentioned. One is virtuous to the extent that one's policies produce results, but of course that necessitates and implies some antecedent idea of what good results are versus bad results. And I think this is very much being lived out, and I don't think that China knows the answer to what that means today.
Eric McVaden, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. Let me toss off the aside first. Charles, I think I know some institutes and NGOs and so forth, whether Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao believe in solar panels and the green world and so forth, that they've become convinced anyway. But my real question is, has Arthur's bus, is it turning a corner right now? In this China that we see that's prosperous, emerged, and so forth, or maybe is it shifting from the bus
If
to
it
the
is
Airbus?
turning a corner, it's doing it on 2 wheels.
Well, that's exactly what I mean.
Yeah.
Are we seeing essentially something? Is there a transformation or simply a continuation? I liked your analogies, and so maybe shifting to an Airbus, but I asked the authors.
Well, what makes these people think that social science is any better at this stuff than this kind of highfalutin intellectual stuff? I mean, after all, there's all kinds of predictions about the future made by, as China get richer, it's going to become more democratic. If the GDP, per capita GDP passes some magic numbers.
3,000.
3,000. Well, then there's some other people who say, but the party doesn't believe that. They say the richer the place become, the more people are willing to acquiesce in one-party rule. They both can't be right. So on the question of trying to understand, how the bus is going or how it's careening and so on, seems to me as an outsider kind of looking at it. What Ashley says about, let's call it the sort of fractionalization of places and the creation of diverse interests of every sort, regional, economic, political, and so on. It seems to me it becomes more and more pronounced. It seems to me it becomes harder and harder for the people in charge to maintain a kind of unitary vision of the state or of the society. If you don't think so, you should read the Constitution of the Communist Party of China, which you all can read. It's in English on their website. And it explains the governing principles of the, Communist Party of China, beginning with Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought, and completely with a harmonious society. So if you say to someone just for fun, tease them a little bit, well, could you explain to me the relationship between sort of Mao Zedong thought, on the one hand, the creation of the harmonious society, on the other, they just tell you, you lack subtlety. Or you don't, if you spent more time at the higher party school and so on. So, I mean, I think they've got a very, very, as Ashley said, look, there's a very, very difficult situation they've got. Let's just, let me take 1,300,000,000 people, fastest rate of urbanization in the world, contemplation of another 200 or 300 million people moving into cities in the 15 or 20 years. Subversives all over the place, like NGOs and whatnot, who believe in green, who believe in women's rights, who believe in gay. In other words, all the stuff that's destroying us, you see, is starting to work on them, and that's a fine thing. If you look at it this way, it's a strategic matter. That's the point. So we're in favor of all of these things. A lot of lawsuits, a lot of civic action, a lot of all of this kind of stuff. It makes it much harder to maintain coherent national strategies, you see, and coherent national purpose, and direct the resources of the society to one end. I think that's becoming harder and harder all the time in today's China.
There and then after.
I'm Gil Rosman, Princeton University and the Woodrow Wilson International Center. And my question really relates to the issue of hierarchy and equality. And how much depth do we have in understanding that issue? And I'm going to read both books with great interest because I think this is an issue with deep historical background. And China is the country of many decades that's been most forceful in arguing for equality. Whether it's about the Soviet Union's error as a leading the socialist country, or the U.S. hegemonism, or a whole series of other issues. It is the 5 peaceful principles of coexistence that's forcefully pro-equality. But I'm on the side that China leans heavily towards hierarchy. And you can see many tests for that. And I'd like to see what tests have been brought to bear to understand this gap between their claims and their basic approach. And my sense is that this goes back to history, and the Goguryeo dispute with South Korea is one example where they've imposed the hierarchy, and the way they've treated South Korea, I think, has been maybe the litmus test of whether they're willing to accept equality in relations or willing to are insistent on a more hierarchical relationship in this region. It seems to me there are a lot of debates and sources that can be brought together to put all this together and draw a conclusion about what type of hierarchy, not just hierarchy versus equality, but the pattern of Chinese thinking about hierarchy. And I'd like to hear more reflections about that.
Well, thank you very much for that observation, Professor Rosman. I had made a note apropos of what would Mao Dun say, and his name, of course, means contradiction in Chinese. That's his pen name. What would he have said if he came back? And I think one of the things he would say is, for God's sake, all we did in our youth was rail against hierarchy. Hierarchy in the family, hierarchy in the markets, hierarchy in society, hierarchy in rule. And yet you've now got a situation where I was having lunch with a China watcher, and he was talking about how we're now looking at the 6th and 7th generations of leadership in the People's Republic, and in many cases these putative new leaders are the children or the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren of people who were leaders before. And this is not only very hierarchical, this is very unlike the way traditional China was, because there was no instance in all of Chinese history, to my knowledge, where in any family, the grandfather, the father, and the son all passed the Jinshi examination. There was enough social mobility that you couldn't have, that you never got 3 generations all hitting the jackpot intellectually, as it were. Today, if you look at the correlation of wealth to party status, it's pretty close. And as Gil says, there is something very discordant about the first 30 years of the People's Republic, with its intense proclamation of the communal values. We're going to abolish families. We're going to have communal kitchens. We're going to dress the same way. There are going to be no uniforms in the military, and all of this kind of stuff. And the situation we have now, which is a very strong hierarchy. So I thank you. I think, and I'd also like to say about Jack's question about virtue. That we don't have time to answer that one completely today, but that's a very, very perceptive question, I think.
Can I just add, just to mention, Professor Rosman is the, I don't know, let's say at the Hudson Institute, we'll use the word maven, the maven of Chinese study of China's study of the problems of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union. There's a great big issue there. Why, we don't pay any attention to it, but it's a huge issue in China, and very important, I think, in many ways on these issues. The problem is that the equality scores these. There are many examples in the modern period in the West and in China where this equality stuff starts out okay and doesn't work out, like the Soviet Union, like Mao's China, like the heavenly kingdom of great peace, like any of these other aspirational, millenarian, religious-based things in China where people are constantly rising up and trying to level things and so on. It just seems to reinforce the wisdom that there is no other way. At the end of the day, this is it, and so we have to, and it provides a certain rationalization. I mean, we here are all princelings, and it's astonishing how the economic power in the country is increasingly concentrated in the children of communist hierarchies. Is absolutely astonishing. It's an astonishing sort of thing. I mean, it's worse even than the kind of China Inc. It is, in fact, going back, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I'll say it anyway, to the way things were supposed to be in the bad old days of the Kuomintang. The 4 families, I don't know how many families there are now in China, not 4, but 26. or some small number like that. It's really quite an astonishing concentration of wealth in private hands.
But there certainly is a very powerful thrust in modern Chinese foreign policy, for instance, talking about norms of equality, and that inequality, as it always has, generally tends to sound better when you're sort of on the bottom than when you are higher on the totem pole. It becomes unattractive as one rises, and that the open question that I try to raise is what happens as China rises up that totem pole. I mean, the issues, the norms of non-interference and sovereign equality are very important if you're trying to keep someone from telling you not to abuse, Falun Gong practitioners or oppressed Tibetans and that sort of thing. It's a marvelous riposte. It's very useful. The question is, to what extent has this stuff been actually internalized? And there's some great stuff in China's early 20th century diplomatic history when they begin to sort of discover. I have an anecdote in the book of China's first sort of ambassador, if you will, going overseas and hearing about this. Well, there's this thing called international law. They have a book of this stuff, and it actually might be really useful if we could learn this, because it's a way to provide answers to them when they come pressing things upon us, and we can sort of cite this stuff of theirs against them. These are marvelously useful and powerful tools in a sense. I mean, we have the growth of the unequal treaty problem. Which is, of course, a problem precisely because they're unequal. I mean, it presupposes that it is unfair to be pressed into such things. And all of that is fine as far as it goes, but the open question is, to what extent is this an instrumental value, and to what extent is this something that has truly been sort of sucked into one's bones, as it were? And I don't know, but it's not as simple. I mean, certainly to listen to the surface pronouncements, I think, would be somewhat dangerous.
If you wanted the most cogent exposition of why there should be zero tax on investment in capital gains, then you have to go to China. And the very powerful arguments for all of these tax cuts for the rich and flat taxes and other sorts of things. And also all kinds of ethic of private provision now, rather than ethic of common provision with medical care and all of these sorts of things. It's really quite startling from that point of view.
Sure. Let's turn to the last question, then we've got to be pretty quick because we're running over.
Okay. Xiao Chen, freelance correspondent. Also said that China is just like a bus, have lots of people. A bus with lots of people is easy to break down. So my question is this: where the overpopulation of China to go? They got to go somewhere. If not go somewhere, it won't be good for China and for the world. And we talk about reform. Reform have been said have to be from outside, but that's not true. The last reform in China is from rural mass, and Deng Xiaoping is the reason Deng Xiaoping is great because he can read the mind of mass. So I'm saying is this: elite and party won't lead China. It's Chinese mass to lead China. So my question is this: how do we read the mind and thinking of the mass? And can you talk about continuity? Continuity need to be in terms of, as Ashley said, is my interpretation, history, culture, and the tradition. A Chinese leader, as I see, really don't understand that. I'm saying is this: not just Chinese leader, all the world leader need to learn the Chinese history, culture, and tradition. How get it done? Thank you.
Sure.
I think at this point, with China on the trajectory that it has been on for the last 30 years, anyone who cares about public policy and international affairs and so forth, who fails to spend some time attending to learning a bit more about China and where it is and where it has come from, is probably guilty of some kind of policy geek malpractice.
You want to learn some Chinese, you can go to your closest Confucius Institute, which is a project of the Chinese government. It's interesting when you say about Confucius, as I understand it, they tried to think of some representative Chinese person that people who had heard of, we couldn't call them the Mao Zedong Institute. No one, there aren't any other Chinese people, I think, that non-Chinese people have ever heard of, who are real people.
There's Sun Yat-sen.
Sun Yat-sen, maybe.
But there would be some problems
Yao
with the
Ming,
communists sponsoring that. Yeah,
exactly.
Yao Ming would be the third, and then you're off into sort of fictional, Charlie Chan or something. I mean, it's really, no. I mean, if I do this with students, I say, name me five famous Chinese people, some points where, or A. Wright or any person, but Well, they don't do much better with Europe. You know, after Napoleon and Churchill, they kind of run out of. It's true, but that's look on the problem. What the mass thinks in China, I worry a lot about that because best one can tell, you know, they're buying DVDs, they're playing video games, there are all of these online video game things going. There's all this watching soap opera, doing the movies, and I think that the state, unfortunately. Or it depends, but it wants to encourage people to do. The more they do that, the less they're interested in politics. So, to the extent to which you can create a kind of gigantic Disneyland for all that to occupy the interests of the people, that's a good way of ruling this kind of modern mass commercial society. I think they learned that probably from Habermas, in whom they've become increasingly interested by.
Well, actually, there's an old Chinese tradition of the so-called Yumin Zhengce, the policy of keeping the people stupid and ignorant.
Oh, yes.
And I think this question about how you know what's going on in the minds of ordinary Chinese is extremely difficult to answer. I have Waldron's 3 laws of Chinese that you meet. If they give you a card, now of course if it's someone that you've known for a long time, it doesn't apply, but if you're just going around collecting cards at institutes, the first thing is you don't know whether the name is actually the person's name. Second, you don't know whether the job that is listed is actually the person's job. And the third is that no matter what they tell you, you have no idea whatsoever what they really think, because what they really think is reserved maybe for their wife and adult children, but not much beyond that. Now, many of us in the China field have the very great good fortune to be married to Chinese wives. Gil, sadly, has not availed himself of this opportunity. He has a wonderful wife, but she's not Chinese. My wonderful Chinese wife puts herself to sleep by watching Chinese soap operas from the TV, and they are either about the situation today and good people who are brought down by corrupt officials and wicked policemen and all this kind of stuff, or else they're costume dramas about the Qing dynasty and the struggle between corrupt officials and clean officials. And these things are really very near the bone. And I wonder to myself, how is it? I mean, the Chinese have a very sophisticated historical sense. Surely they understand that if you make a drama about corruption of the elite, say when Hudson was the head eunuch or something like that, that people today are going to begin to draw connections. And why are they doing this? So I think there is, in my experience in going to China and talking, the people I talk to, admittedly, are not a random sample or any sort of a sample. They tend to be people who are in the academic world. But the first thing that comes up in a discussion of the situation is corruption. And one of my students, who's now a professor at Peking University, said to me, he said, "This place is so corrupt, you've never seen anything like it. It's more," and my immediate reaction, having spent some time in this city, is, how could anywhere be more corrupt than Washington? But I'll take his, I'll take his word. He said China's never been this corrupt in its history. It's totally corrupt, but it's also growing economically. And the question is whether the corruption is going to crush the economy or whether the economic growth is going to crush the corruption. So maybe we can leave it at that.
Great. On that note, in my role as head eunuch, I will call this session adjourned. I want to thank our outstanding panelists, Arthur, Ashley, and our 2 authors, Charles and Chris. Books. The books are available in the back, $20 a piece. The authors will sign them. I also want to thank my colleagues, Grace Terzian, Yannis Saratsis, Jamie Bologna, and Joel Winton for assistance with today's event. Thank you very much for coming.
$20, by the way, is a substantial discount.